Well, good morning, everyone. I read through the scripture and it kind of sparked a memory. About 20 years ago on NPR, while I was milking on Sunday morning, they had a program called Speaking of Faith. And this woman, I can't pronounce her name, Zornberg. If you've ever seen the Bill Maher's program on Genesis, where he had a panel of experts on religion come in and talk about the whole book of Genesis. This took weeks and weeks. She was one of the panelists. And she was on Speaking of Faith talking about the Passover story, but it went far beyond that. What we have in our Bible is the Cliff Notes version, or maybe the edited for TV version of those first two books of the Bible. This woman has a PhD in English literature, psychiatry, and Hebrew studies. Just to give you a perspective of everything that goes into that. So when you see things in this story, you hear something that said, why did they say that? Well, there was another entire story that was left out that fed into our stories today. You've got a list of all the people that moved from the Israelites that moved to Egypt as Exodus starts. And those 70 men died. And no one else was mentioned for 400 years until today's story. The first two Israelites that were mentioned was a pair of midwives. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiprah and the other Puah, I have no idea if that's correct or not, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? Allowed the boys to live. The midwives said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife even gets there. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then the Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live.
Yes, thank you for that, choir. So how many of you before the scripture reading this morning had heard of the story of Shiprah and Puah? Okay, great. We have a few hands. That's great. Now, how many of you have heard of Moses? Okay. See, most people recognize Moses' name, but not as many people recognize the name and story of Shiprah and Puah. But this story in Scripture is the beginning to Moses' story. And these two women, I forgot how much I love their story because, a confession, sometimes reading Scripture can be boring. But when I was reading this story, I was like, yes, there are really great parts to the story that I forget are in there that have a lot to say. And these two are the face of radical resistance in an empire, and in this case, the Egyptian empire, that is committing genocide. In fact, Shiprah and Puah are one of the first acts of civil disobedience in Scripture. See, faithful resistance begins with ordinary people, sometimes people we may not have even heard of, who choose to say no to fear and yes to life. It's the beginning thread of liberation that weaves our faith story together. So the story begins in Exodus, right, the second book of the Bible. How many of y'all sung Pharaoh, Pharaoh growing up? Okay, that might date me a little bit or something, or church camp or VBS. Okay. So this is the Pharaoh, right, in this story. The new king, the Pharaoh, that has just come into power. We don't know much about this new Pharaoh. In fact, his name is not even recorded in the scripture. And we don't know. Maybe he was this kind and generous person when he rose to power and looked after all the people in his land. But as Abraham Lincoln said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. But what we do know is he is intimidated by the Israelites, the foreigners. See, this new Pharaoh, he doesn't know the old stories. He must have forgotten or doesn't remember that Joseph, an Israelite, once saved Egypt from starvation. All he sees are foreigners, and they're everywhere. And the more he looks around and the more he sees people who aren't white men who are running things, he gets increasingly insecure. See, the Israelite people are having children, neighborhoods are growing, crops are thriving, and the streets echo with the laughter in a language that isn't Egyptian. And Pharaoh's heart continues to harden. They are not like us, he says. And so Pharaoh begins to imagine all the things, the terrible things that could happen. See, deep down, it's insecurity. What if they rise up? What if they take over? What if they side with the enemies? Fear has a way of making fiction feel like fact. And just like that, the divide is drawn. We, they, insiders and outsiders, people with power and people who must be controlled. And that's where the story turns. See, if the problem is the Israelites are increasing in number and thus a threat to Pharaoh's continued power, what is the solution? See, Pharaoh doesn't begin with violence. He begins with strategy. Let's give them jobs. Let's make them useful. Let's assign taskmasters to them. Maybe that will slow them down. But the work is backbreaking, it's forced, it's cruel. And what started out as just, they are not like us, how do we know we can trust them not to take over, then became, let us make sure we put them in their place with economic suppression, inhumane working conditions, unfair wages. But the Israelites remain. See, Pharaoh continues to watch the numbers rise and fear continues to swell in him. So he tightens his grip. He doubles down on their labor. He builds cities on their backs. He drives them into the dirt. Let's have them do our dirty work. Let's oppress them so that they will know their place, that they will know they are less than. Oppression becomes policy. Labor becomes slavery. And then, when that still doesn't work, when the people of God refuse to wither, Pharaoh's fear boils over. And that's where our story begins today. Because see, unchecked rhetoric of us and them leads to the unchecked treatment of the other, and then ultimately escalates to violence. See, how those in power speak about others leads to violence. See, Shiprah and Puah are midwives. Now, remember, this is ancient Egypt. They didn't have OBGYNs and hospitals, right? They had midwives. They delivered the babies. These are the women. They were used to whispers, used to being called in the middle of the night, slipping through alleyways and back doors to the sound of labor. Perhaps Shiprah carried herbs for pain and infection in her satchel and prayers on her breath. Perhaps Puah kept a cloth tied at her waist and stories from her grandmother folded in her memory, just like the birthing stool that had been passed down to her. Scholars estimate the infant mortality rate during that time, ancient Egypt, was 25 to 30%, and maternal mortality rate was 1 to 3%, or 10 to 15% over a woman's childbearing lifetime. Women's reproductive health was one of the most vulnerable parts of life in ancient society. See, Shiprah and Puah, they had seen the worst of empire up close. They had walked among the Hebrew slaves. They had heard lullabies sung in fear. And still, there was something sacred in their work of helping bring life into the world. But one day, the summons came, not to a birth, but to a king. He stood above them, I imagine, robed in gold and wrapped in power, and he didn't ask questions, he gave orders. And he said to them, when you assist the Hebrew women, if the child is a boy, end his life quietly before the mother knows. Let the girls live, but the boys must die. Now, I imagine maybe that Shiprah looked at the floor and Puah didn't breathe. They left Pharaoh's palace in silence, maybe. Maybe that night they sat by the river and they didn't say much. The stars were dim and the fear was thick. Puah, maybe she said, what will we do? And Shiprah, I don't know, but I know this, we were not made to be instruments of death. Perhaps Puah's voice trembled, but he could kill us. He could kill our families. He could. Puah leaned in, and still, I suspect that they didn't decide in a single moment. I suspect it wasn't a fiery protest, just 1,000 small acts of resistance. Each time they showed up to help a woman breathe. Each time they stayed when it would have been safer to walk away. Each time they placed a living, crying boy in his mother's arms. Each time they left with blood on their hands, but not death. And so, Pharaoh summons them. He says, where are the boys? Why have you not done what I've asked? Did you hear their clever response? I don't know, Pharaoh. The Hebrew women, when they give birth, they're just stronger than we imagine. They're not like the Egyptians. They give birth even before we arrive. They don't need us. They didn't know if he believed them. They didn't know if he would let them leave, but they had made their choice. They would not be midwives of murder. They would be the hands of life. But the story goes on. See, even after Shiprah and Puah stood their ground, Pharaoh didn't stop. In fact, his violence escalated. And if we continue reading the story in Exodus, we see he broadened the order. Now it wasn't just the midwives that were instructed to kill boys. All the Egyptian people were commanded to throw every Hebrew baby boy into the Nile. See, that's the hardest part, isn't it? We want resistance to work instantly. We want one brave act to stop injustice cold, but sometimes it doesn't. And even so, God is at work, because while Pharaoh was doubling down, a Hebrew woman was weaving a basket together, her small act of resistance to hide her son. She placed him gently in the reeds, and down the river, Pharaoh's own daughter, yes, from inside the palace of power, saw the baby, and her act of resistance was to pick him up, to say no to her father's decree and yes to life. And years later, that baby, Moses, would rise up and lead the people out of slavery in Egypt. See, I don't think Shiprah and Puah didn't know. I don't think they knew all that. All they knew was, we can't be a part of this evil. But their small no wasn't all alone. It was joined with another and another until there was a whole web of resistance of mothers, daughters, sisters, rebels woven by God until it opened a path to freedom. Ordinary people saying no to fear and yes to life. See, they were just ordinary people, perhaps nobodies, trying to be faithful to God and do the right thing. And the thing we shouldn't miss is they were essentially being offered power with Pharaoh. They had a chance for him to be indebted to him. They could have secured their own protection, their own well-being, and they were essentially handing it away. They were opening themselves and their families up to harm, to punishment. And they probably didn't know in that moment that they had power and that 3,000 plus years later, we'd still be telling their story. All they had was the belief that it mattered to God how they acted. See, we need the Moseses and the Martin Luther Kings and the Nelson Mandelas, and also behind every one of them, we need the many people who made a way, who inspired them. And sometimes I wonder if us ordinary folks here in Statesville, North Carolina, the crossroads of the future, think that because we aren't a powerful somebody, then we don't have a part in God's story, that we don't have a responsibility in the story of God's grace, redemption, and liberation. Now, you may be thinking, if I was asked to kill newborn babies, or anyone for that matter, it would be clear and easy to make that decision, right? That's a clear line, and even if it takes courage, I would say no. But I want us to think about a few things. One, when you're asked to do something compromising by a superior, especially when it is couched in, well, there's good that will come from it in the short term, it can be really hard to resist. This good in the short term could be, well, me and my family's lives depend on it. Or what if Pharaoh is right and many of these foreigners are criminals? Also, there is the scenario that some of us are just rule followers. And you just do what you're told and you just say, well, I don't make the rules, I just follow them. See, Shiprah and Puah were breaking the law in their resistance. And 3, they were just 2 insignificant people in the midst of a tyrannical regime. The outcome that Shiprah and Puah witnessed after making their courageous move to not kill these Hebrew boys most likely felt disappointing to them, because Pharaoh just keeps on marching with his plan to wipe out these babies, demanding that all his people throw them into the Nile River. So if you did the right thing and it seemingly made no difference, would you do it anyway? If you stood up to an oppressor, a bully, and it didn't stop them, would you do it anyway? Would you keep on resisting? Would you hold on to the promise, this hope that liberation is the ultimate desire of God, that the moral arc bends towards justice? See, the story of Pharaoh and his fear of a growing people, of policies built on they are not like us, of leaders turning neighbors into threats, that story isn't ancient history. Pharaoh is still speaking, and his words echo through our systems, through our laws, through rhetoric. And just like in Exodus 1, it often starts subtly. Make life harder for the other, harder to afford food, harder to get services, harder to get health care. Deny them basic dignity. Make them feel like they don't belong. Say it's about order or safety or waste, fraud, and abuse. But if left unchecked, fear turns into cruelty, and cruelty becomes law, and law becomes death. And that is why our resistance matters, even if it feels small. Just like Shiprah and Puah, just like the mother who hid her child, just like the daughter who reached into the Nile, we may never see the full fruit of our resistance, but we trust that God is at work in the ordinary, and that every act of courage is a seed of freedom. Do you know in North Carolina, the Child Fatality Task Force, in 2023, black infants in the state died at 3 times the rate of white infants? Did you know that North Carolina ranked 10th highest in the country for infant mortality? Did you know that nationally in 2021, the maternal mortality rate for black women was more than double the national average? This is not theoretical. This is not distant. This is happening here. These are our children, our neighbors, our mothers, and we cannot pretend that it's not. See, Shiprah and Puah didn't just save babies, they stood in the gap for life when empire had chosen death. And I don't know about y'all, but I want my girls to know the names of Shiprah and Puah and their story. I want them to grow up believing that ordinary people, especially women, can say no to fear and yes to life. Because that's what our faith is made of, not just creeds and Sunday worship and rituals, but hands that catch life and hold one another up, that cradle the new, the tender, the not yet born future. So I ask you, do we want to offer our hands and our lives to empower, to protect, to support what is being born in our midst? Do we want to be part of a web of resistance woven by love and hope and justice? So usually in our seasons of grace, we have time for talk back. And so I ask you, what does resistance look like today? Because the thing about preaching in a sermon, it's not the end of the discussion. It's meant to be the beginning. So what does the story of Shiprah and Puah mean for us here and now today? Does anyone have any thoughts or reflections that come up?
That this goes where my mind went to the part where they were afraid of God more so than Pharaoh. And everything happened because of their fear of God. And so I was trying to connect that with the other things that you were saying. I was like, our people, the newer people, like Martin Luther King Jr., anybody that did something significant, I don't feel like they were doing it out of fear of retribution from God anyway. So it's just making me think where, it's like Neil said, what they wrote, you never know why they wrote or put in what they put in. So was that fear of God something different? Was it being?
Yeah, so fear, and there, we could go into a whole Sunday school lesson on fear and what that word meant. And I don't know off the top of my head what it, in Hebrew, but it's often considered more of this awe type thing. They believed and they thought of, if you were in the direct presence of God, you couldn't be in the direct presence of God and still live. So it was this sort of fear and awe, not like fear of a tyrannical God. But yes, what's the motivation behind why they do what they do? What drives them, yeah.
Historically, right now, I think it's very timely in the sense that we all know that, the walls are tumbling down in the minds of a lot of people, and you feel helpless and you wonder what you as an individual can do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the question we all have to answer. How do we respond today, now, to a situation that's not totally dissimilar? And where there is a threat, if you get too loud, make too much noise, that things would be very uncomfortable for you and yours. So it's very timely, and I guess in some ways the answer to that is what we all have to come up with individually, and perhaps as a community.
Yes, definitely.
I think one thing is going off of making sure that you're doing, not doing what's too uncomfortable for being safe with for you and your family, is seeing what's safe to do for you and yours while also being a safe space for the people that you care for that are in those underserved and underrepresented communities. Making sure that the people in those communities know that you are a safe space for them. So just knowing, even the little things of making it known publicly that you're not the kind of person that other people can say those negative, racist, homophobic things in front of, that you're going to shut that down. Those little things are such a big step in the right direction for us and for the others. The other big things could be, calling senators, sharing resources. If you can't be the one that's going out into the community making these big change is going to protest because it puts you at risk for your career, for your family. Share those resources with others that can do those things. Be that person in the back doing the support, give the water bottles, give the healthcare resources, give whatever you can, make those phone calls.
Yeah, definitely.
Things
And
that you can do.
and you name an important thing is we all have different, we're not all equal in our place of who's most at risk, right? And those of us that have some privileges should be willing to do more, right? To protect those that are perhaps more vulnerable. And it can be as small as, quote unquote small, right? As standing up for some not great comments, right? And letting others know that's not okay. So, yes, thank you.
I think there is a fear now as somebody that used to protest quite a bit. A lot of my friends are afraid of getting arrested and not getting out. Before, we didn't worry about civil disobedience. We knew we would get out. Now, I don't think, we were worried when Reverend Barber got arrested at the Capitol. We didn't know if he'd get out that time. And there was a big fear when that happened.
Yeah.
Because things are so different. Before, you could kind of depend on civil disobedience. Now, it's like, you know, are they gonna make it illegal, or what are they gonna do?
It's kind of a timely discussion because I just got a text or an email from somebody asking me if I wanted to go to the No Kings Day of Defiance on the 14th here in town. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, people are organizing, and sometimes it can feel like, I don't know, you have to look for others that are also willing to say, no, we care, we're standing for love. Yeah.
I think realizing too that we're all at different places and we all have different skills, and at different times in our lives, we're called to do different things too. A lot of times I've been called to be, in the middle of the protests and marching and that kind of things. Other times, the most important thing for me is whispering in people's ears, and sometimes with them not even kind of knowing I'm doing it, because I think we change people by relationships, and so sometimes, I have the ability to be around people that have extremely different views than me, and I can get in conversations with them that aren't, that don't turn antagonistic, that we can keep dialogue going. And I don't always like it. Last year I almost gave up one of my best friends because we had such different ideas, and he was just making me so mad with some of his public statements. And then I kind of looked and went, we've been friends since I was 22. I know his heart, where I know his heart back then. And I know that I'm somebody who can maybe be a positive voice and maybe get him to reconsider things. And so I think there's just so many things we can do. And a lot of times we limit ourselves and we don't, we go, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that. Sometimes we need to do it anyway and scare ourselves.
Right.
Because we need to do scary things in our lives. But other times I think we just need to use those gifts that we've been given.
Yes, definitely. And I think we would, if we keep our eyes open and are looking for ways, those moments will most likely present themselves. And it's important to do some of that prep work so that when those moments do arise, you can kind of dig in and have that courage to do the right thing. So some of us among us may be called to lead movements like William Barber and Moses, but most of us will live our lives in quieter resistance ways, in classrooms, in hospital rooms, in city council meetings, at kitchen tables. See, the work of resistance is not about being the leader of the movement. It's about being faithful, because faith has always called us to act. Because as ordinary as we are, we can be used in extraordinary ways for justice, for liberation, for life. And so be on the lookout for stories like this of ordinary people doing radical things for love, and let's collect and share these stories, because I do think that's what keeps us going. So please let us stand for our benediction.